So thanks everyone for being here today. Again, I'm Michelle Daley. I'm a research scientist in Bill McDowell's research group in the Department of Natural Resources at UNH. And our group is really focused on water quality. So we're going to shift gears a bit from the forests and the animals and take a look at the streams. Our group's done a lot of work in a variety of places in New Hampshire, also in Puerto Rico, really trying to understand how the watershed landscape really affects the water quality that is delivered to those receiving streams. So again, today specifically I'm going to talk about how forests, farms, and people contribute nitrogen to Great Bay. And so just to kind of step back and answer the question, well, why do we care about nitrogen? And it's because nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, can accelerate this process of eutrophication. So when you have nutrients delivered in excess from the landscape, you can have algae grow that form these large algal blooms that block sunlight from getting into the water column. And then when those algal blooms die, they decompose and suck up oxygen from the water, which is detrimental to the fish communities and other aquatic life that live there. So not only do you have that process occurring, but you can also have phytoplankton that grow on submerged aquatic vegetation that block the light from getting to that vegetation, cause it to die. When that dies, it decomposes and again sucks more oxygen out of the stream. So that's why we're concerned about nutrients. And here in particular, we're concerned about nitrogen because that tends to be the nutrient that is most limited in coastal zones or estuaries. So when there's excess of that, it really fuels that productivity versus lakes tend to be phosphorus limited. So when there's excess phosphorus, that accelerates this process of eutrophication there. So now, why are we concerned about Great Bay? Well, most of you probably know it's our largest, most significant estuary in New Hampshire. It's actually home to about 25% of New Hampshire's population in that watershed that drains to the bay. The watershed intersects 52 communities, 42 of those are in New Hampshire, 10 of those are in Maine. And there's been a deterioration of water quality and aquatic life in the bay over several years. The Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership, acronym is PREP, puts out a State of Our Estuaries report every 3 years, and they documented that there's been a significant loss of oysters and clams. A lot of that's due to disease. There's been increased suspended sediment in the bay. There's been increased nitrogen concentrations. There's been documented low dissolved oxygen levels in the tidal rivers that drain into the bay. And there's been a loss of eelgrass in the bay itself, which is shown here in this picture. And it's a really critical habitat for the aquatic life in the bay. That's really the nursery for the fisheries there. So because of this, mainly because of the low oxygen levels and the loss of eelgrass, the bay has been listed as impaired for nitrogen, meaning that it's in violation of the Federal Clean Water Act. So there's a really strong urge to deal with these nutrients and clean up the bay. So here is Great Bay proper right here. This is the Piscataqua River. This is in southeast New Hampshire. And this is the entire land area that drains to this estuary system. As you can see here, this map is mostly green, so there's a lot of forests in this landscape, but we do have some development along the major rivers, which is shown here in red. And then we also have wastewater treatment facilities that treat human waste and discharge it to some of these major rivers or to the bay itself. And these are these black asterisks shown here throughout the watershed. So those wastewater treatment plants contribute about 30%. PREP says 32% of the nitrogen getting to Great Bay comes from those wastewater treatment facilities. The rest, about 70%, comes from what we call non-point sources. These are very dispersed, diffuse sources throughout the entire watershed. They're things like septic systems, fertilizers, both for residential use or for agricultural use, pet waste, livestock waste, and then atmospheric deposition. So the Northeast has been referred to as the tailpipe of the U.S., so we receive a lot of air pollution from the power plants and the other parts of the U.S., and so that kind of comes out in the rain, in the snow, and we do end up with a lot of nitrogen coming in from the sky, rain, snow, and also what we call dry deposition, which is you can kind of think of dust settling out onto the landscape. So that's where, that's how we've characterized these sources broadly in the whole watershed. And our group wanted to ask the question, well, we know a bit about some of the major rivers that drain into the bay, but we really don't know a lot about the spatial variability of the water quality in the small streams throughout the entire watershed. I probably should have backed up and point out that our group has studied the Lamprey River, which here is the largest tributary to Great Bay, for the last 10 years. So we have a lot of good information here, but we really have little sense of what the nitrogen concentrations are in the streams throughout the other parts of the watershed. So that's what this study was trying to tackle. So how do the nitrogen concentrations in surface waters throughout the entire watershed respond to various levels of landscape characteristics? So if you have more development, do we see more nitrogen? If we have more nitrogen inputs, more septic systems, more fertilizers, more livestock, do we see more nitrogen in the receiving streams? So to tackle this question, we've been working on it for the past, almost 5 years now. This project has been wrapping up. It definitely was more involved than we had initially thought, but we've gotten some good information here. And what we did, and I'm only going to talk about part of this today, but if folks are interested in this study more, I'd be happy to chat after about it. We went out 5 times during 2010 through 2012 and sampled as many streams as we could. And what we ended up capturing was 236 sites that we sampled 5 times, and those sites were selected so they span the full range of urban, suburban, and agricultural land use. Now this is New Hampshire, so it's not urban Boston, it's urban New Hampshire. And what we mean by what we're calling urban here is a site that might look like this. This is a site in Newmarket where we have a small stream draining down to a major, this is the Lamprey River here, and everyone in this small watershed or small catchment is relying on the central wastewater treatment facility to treat their waste and move it outside of that catchment. Suburban sites might look something like this, where from the stream, everything looks great. It's a relatively intact forested riparian zone, but throughout the watershed, you have houses that are relying on private wells, private septic systems for waste disposal, so the impact is a bit more subtle than you have here with centralized water supply and centralized waste management. So from those 236 sites and the 5 samples we got from each of them, we analyzed those stream samples for the various different forms of nitrogen. The first is the category called dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which is really the nitrate in the ammonium. And this form of nitrogen tends to be the most bioavailable, as we call it. So it really fuels that eutrophication process more so than other types of nitrogen. The other form we looked at is this broad category of dissolved organic nitrogen, and then also the total dissolved nitrogen. So now we had to characterize the landscape that drains to those sites, and we looked at what we're calling the human impact, the human population density, the amount of people that rely on septic systems versus sewer systems for waste disposal, the amount of impervious cover, the pavement, the rooftops, the roads, the development percentages, the high intensity through the low intensity development, the amount of agriculture, which is we have very little row crop agriculture in New Hampshire. Most of the agriculture really tends to be this fields and pasture or hay uses. And then finally, we characterize the natural features, the forest, the scrub shrub, the water, and the wetlands. So we put all this information into what's called a partial least squared regression analysis, which don't focus on that. But what it does was it connects all of those landscape features and says which one of those are important in predicting nitrogen concentrations. And here we're looking at the results for the dissolved inorganic nitrogen. And we see that the population density, the percent developed, the impervious cover, the forests, and the wetlands are all significant predictors of how spatially variable those nitrogen concentrations are. So when you have more people, when you have more development, you have more impervious cover, you have more inorganic nitrogen in those streams. That's what these coefficients tell you here. When you have more forests and you have more wetlands, you actually have less nitrogen in those streams. So the forests and the wetlands are acting to retain or remove that nitrogen. The other thing it tells us here is what's the relative importance of these variables. And we see that wetlands are really important at removing that inorganic nitrogen. What I thought was interesting is that agriculture is not listed here. It was not a significant predictor of the spatial variability of inorganic nitrogen at these sites. It just is not that important driver at the Great Bay watershed scale. So what we also learned from this is that these, what we're calling these human factors, tend to cluster together onto one factor that can explain about 24% of the variability in the inorganic nitrogen, whereas the forests and the wetlands cluster together on a different factor that explains about 5% of the spatial variability. So now if we move, so here I'm just showing you an example of these univariate relationships. So here we see as you increase population density, you increase the dissolved inorganic nitrogen concentrations. There's a fair amount of scatter here, but there is this overall pattern. And again, when you increase the amount of wetlands, you're retaining or removing the dissolved inorganic nitrogen from those systems. So now if we look at the results for that different type of nitrogen, that dissolved organic nitrogen, we're seeing that it's really all about the wetlands. The wetlands were, there were three variables that were retained: the wetlands, the cultivated crops, and the pasture and hay. And the wetlands really had the largest positive coefficient here, and the cultivated crops and the pasture and hay do also tend to increase the nitrogen, but not to the extent that the wetlands do. And again, just like before, what we learned from this analysis is that the wetlands tend to cluster on one factor, which can explain about 35% of the spatial variability in the dissolved organic nitrogen. And the agricultural land uses, the crops and the pasture and hay, can only explain about 1% of the spatial variability. And here, this is again an example of the one-to-one relationship, where as you increase wetlands here, you're increasing the dissolved organic nitrogen. So, to answer the second part of the question, we had to tally up all of the nitrogen inputs to these sites. And here we're looking at the atmospheric deposition, the inputs with the human waste, the fertilizers, the pet waste, and then the inputs associated with agriculture, which are the fertilizers and the animal waste. And what we found was when you increase the total nitrogen inputs, you correspondingly increase the total nitrogen that's delivered to the streams. Same thing for the dissolved inorganic nitrogen, but what we found is that agriculture, again, was not a strong driver of the nitrogen concentration. So the inputs from ag didn't seem to largely predict the total nitrogen concentrations. For dissolved organic nitrogen, the story was a bit different. There was no relationship to the amount of nitrogen input to these systems, and again, there was a slight increase in response to agriculture. So just to summarize what I have shown, again, humans seem to really have an influence on the dissolved inorganic nitrogen in streams. Forests and wetlands remove it. Agriculture is not a strong player there, and wetlands really are their main source of the dissolved organic nitrogen, not human development. There's a slight influence from ag. And then finally, these models only explained about 30 to 35% of the spatial variability in these concentrations. We thought we would do better than that, and we think it might be because we're spanning such a large range of conditions that we're spanning towns of different ages, different qualities of infrastructure. Infrastructure is new in some places, old in others, and things are more variable out there than we had thought. So I'm just going to move to my acknowledgements here, and certainly want to thank the Ag Experiment Station for funding for some of this work, and particularly the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration for other funding sources that supported this work. So.
Yeah, we have time for a quick question.
So what kind of historical nitrogen levels does Great Bay have, and how far back does the record go?
I think the record goes back to, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe about 30 years. And I'd have to pull up that data to see, but I mean, it's not, I don't think there's been like a doubling or a tripling of nitrogen. It's more, 20, I'd say it's probably exactly. It's more of a creeping up.
I'd be curious to know what it would have been like, say, 100 years ago when there was a ton of agriculture.
Right.
And, cows everywhere.
Right. Yeah, I don't think we have data back that far.